Welcome back to another episode of ADHD Chatter. This week we are joined by a remarkable woman called Geraldine Kostrewa, who has grown a huge following on social media by sharing her experiences of being a parent, a mother with ADHD. Geraldine, welcome.
Hi, thank you. Thanks so much for welcoming me on your podcast. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks so much for taking time out. It's one of the topics that I've been requested, so I'm super excited. I think there's going to be a lot of relatability and a lot of value. I always try and create an arc, and if we were to jump in a time machine and go back to your childhood, but way before parenting, and to see how ADHD showed up in your life, how would you describe yourself as a child?
Oh God, I don't even know where to start. I think it's probably important to mention, I initially was diagnosed as a child with ADHD at around the age of 6 or 7, but I actually didn't find out about that diagnosis until I was 23 and in university, and I started to ask some questions. But basically, the way it showed up in childhood was one of the biggest points is I've always been an excessive talker. I'd often overshare, and I'd get told off for, sharing bits of our private life to sometimes strangers. But then on top of that, I also used to be very, very daydreamy. So that was picked up in primary school, that I'd often doodle along in my book, and I'd start to kind of draw or zone out. And then when I was asked, to repeat what the question was, I often was like, oh, I don't know. And it was so much so to the point that, teachers were getting concerned about my ability to focus on, what was being taught. And truthfully, I did zone out a lot. And often that was kind of unintentional, and it still is the case now to this date, that I'll try very intently to focus on a conversation, on a topic, on even classes when I was in university. But somehow I found myself just zoning out and thinking about, I don't know, what I was going to do after class, for example, or the conversation that I had yesterday, or thinking about, I don't know, why, or the facts about elephants, for example, something completely unrelated, or seemingly unrelated. But a lot of the times my mind would just go 180 miles per hour, still does. And I seemingly come up with somehow unrelated topics. Well, they seem unrelated, but to me they are related, because I go from one topic to another, to another, to another, and then I blurt that out, and people are like, what are you on about? Why are you thinking about those things? And yeah, so that was always the case. I also was not so much disruptive per se, but I was disruptive in the sense that I would often be chatting. I would start to kind of, get distracted by things that I was more interested in than the topic that was discussed. So I actually even remember there was a time where I was in class and I started to paint my hands with coloring pencils, and then I started to draw on my face with those, and then I involved my classmate who was sitting next to me, and we started to draw on each other's faces. And so those kind of things were quite a frequent occurrence, and I was often sent out of class for that, because obviously I was disrupting the learning opportunities that other students had by coming up with alternate activities, as you might say.
Gosh, yes, yeah, there's so much relatability there, and I can see myself in some of what you said, and others not so much, but generally I think there's a lot of relatability there. Did you say that you got a diagnosis, but then it was kept from you?
Yes, yeah. So, and then I don't think, any harm was meant. But obviously, retrospectively, I would have loved to have known it earlier. But basically, yeah, I was assessed and diagnosed with ADHD at the age of 6 or 7. I was treated medically with, medications at that point. And then I don't know how long I took these pills for. At some point, they were stopped because basically my dad, bless him, he came across this book or this research that basically stated that ADHD was just made up for the benefits of the pharma industry. And obviously, he therefore didn't want to put unnecessary drugs in his mind into, his daughter's body. So, that diagnosis then was completely disregarded, therefore, and it was never brought up again. So that was in Switzerland. We moved around quite a bit. Back then, there were still paper notes, so anything that wasn't brought up by my parents wouldn't be mentioned again. We moved from Switzerland back to Germany, and that diagnosis got kind of lost.
When you found out about the diagnosis, how old did you say you were again?
About 23, I believe.
At 23, when you found out, how did you feel?
Big mix of emotions, to be honest. It was actually a weird sense of weight off of my shoulders. It was a weird sense of relief, but at the same time, there was also some frustration and anger. It was a big mix, to be honest. I looked it up and I suddenly felt so heard and seen. I could relate to so many of the difficulties. I mean, going back to how it affected me as a child, I also used to often forget about, very, very important materials. I used to forget homework. I used to forget assignments, exams. I used to forget, school books, pencils, writing materials such as, little notebooks, and I had to borrow them from other students. And I was in detention a lot of the times, therefore. I also ate in classroom, those sort of things. And so basically, when I found out and I looked it up, I suddenly felt like, oh my God, all these difficulties that I've had all my life suddenly have a reason. It felt like there was a sense of validation in there as well, I guess. Because I always felt like I was trying so hard to, do as well as everyone else seemingly was able to get through life. And I always felt like I was falling short, no matter what I tried.
It's such a common thread of everything you just said. It's you hear it so often, particularly amongst women with undiagnosed ADHD, that just not knowing why you struggle with certain things that everyone else just seems to be able to do. And I got anxiety just listening to you repeat some of those stuff from your earlier years, because I could see those in me. And then you get that diagnosis and you're just, that relief, that the shame lifts a little bit, and you get that validation and understanding.
Absolutely. I do have to say, I sort of then almost disregarded the diagnosis myself for a little bit after I found out, because I was like, well, I'm in university now, so obviously I did all right. It must have not impacted me that much, surely. And until I actually looked into it after I became a mum. But I'm sure we'll get through to that point.
What age did you become a mother?
I was 24, just before turning 25. So a month or so later, exactly a month after I became a mum, I turned 25.
With ADHD, and from what I've read, the hormones throughout the menstrual cycle can really amplify traits.
Yeah.
Is that something you relate to?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I actually didn't notice the correlation, or I noticed there was something off, but I didn't realize that there was a correlation up until actually a few months ago, when I started to research, how hormones affected ADHD symptoms. A lot of the times, actually, the reason why ADHD symptoms are often amplified during certain times of the menstrual cycle, because of a hormone drop, and then some hormones rise. And in neurotypical people, that can often then result in some ADHD-like symptoms in the sense that, they have more irritability, they are more forgetful, for example, they're more kind of dysregulated. There's a lot of sort of different things that pop up in neurotypical women already. But if you have ADHD on top, those symptoms are obviously going to be then amplified.
How did that manifest throughout the pregnancy?
In pregnancy, I'm having to laugh because I just wanted to start off. It wasn't that bad. And then I just caught myself. And I had, I think a lot of people put it down as, mum brain or baby brain. But I had it very, very bad. There was one case that I very vividly remember. My partner had gone off to Australia to be the best man of a wedding for his best mate who lives in Australia now. And I was about 14 weeks pregnant or something. And so quite early on. And I don't know what I was trying to do. I think I was trying to lock the garden door, so the door to the garden. And I couldn't lock it. And I was really I was getting very dysregulated because I was thinking to myself, oh my God, I'm alone, I'm pregnant. I don't want to be here without the garden door being locked, especially as we had in that house one instance where randomly a stranger came into our garden at night at 2 a.m. So I was like, gosh, I don't want that to happen when I'm on my own. Anyway, so I would try desperately to lock that door and I couldn't lock it. And so I called my partner who was in Australia. I was like, I don't know what to do, crying and all that stuff. And so bless him, he then called his dad, who, he does a lot of property management. So he's well equipped to help me out to hopefully, lock the door or do something. And so he drives over about an hour or so, hour and a half. And then he comes over and he's like, did you try the right key? I was like, what do you mean? He's like, is that the right key? And I was like, I'm pretty sure it is. And he was like, what about that key just there? And I just completely didn't even see that. I didn't think about that. I didn't see it. I was just like, yeah. And lo and behold, that was the right key then. That just led in the corner that I didn't see. So, yeah.
I was going to ask you what did you call it? Is it pregnancy fog? Brain fog?
Brain,
mum
baby
brain,
yeah.
I was going to ask you what baby brain is, but I think you've explained it through a story.
It's basically forgetfulness, inattention. That is often, seen in pregnant women. And obviously, if you've got ADHD, that's, again, going to be a little bit more amplified.
And although that's a funny story, is there some shame and sort of you lose a bit of confidence if that kind of activity happens often enough, because you
Absolutely.
lose confidence in your ability to keep yourself safe and to do, again, would be considered a basic task, lock the back gate. But if you forget it or you don't do it, or in your case, just choose the wrong key, over time, does that lead to an amplification of some of the comorbidities of ADHD?
I definitely feel that to be the case, especially, there's been studies done showing that neurodivergent people hear over 20,000 more negative comments up until before the age of 12 compared to neurotypical children. So that's a lot more negative comment that we already get, in those early years. And I do feel that those moments, if they happen a lot, which is the case with ADHD, a lot of the times people might comment and be like, oh, this is just a normal thing to happen. But with ADHD, those sort of issues or difficulties that you have, they will often appear often. So sometimes, so multiple times a day, sometimes every day, and if those difficulties appear often enough, they will start to impact on your confidence, on your mental health. You're going to start to try and mask those difficulties. So often women with ADHD will be masking from a very young age because, that's expected of them from society to behave in a certain way. So we often start to mask hyperactivity early on, so that we're not disruptive. And, there's a lot of different things that we'll be masking. And masking is not just even not showing the difficulties that you have, it's often also internalizing those difficulties. So there's something to be said about hyperactive brains. So internalized hyperactivity is, where your thoughts just go mental, basically. They're like 180 miles per hour, jumping from subject to subject with multiple overlaying thought streams at the same time. And also then trying to make up for difficulties that you've had before by, for example, pulling an all-nighter so that you can, do your homework or get studied for the exam because you forgot it up until that night before the exam is due or the assignment is due. And if you forget a lot of the important things, or you're late a lot, like I was always late, by the way, which I also got told off a lot for in school and university, actually. You also start to become known as the person who's always late, who's forgetful, who's a bit, all over the place. And people will joke about that. And I know they probably don't mean any harm, but if you hear jokes often enough, you start to believe them.
It goes back to that reinforced negativity.
Yeah.
I can leave the washing in the machine and forget about it, and it's funny. You do it a couple of times and it's funny, but if you do it often enough, then you question your ability.
Absolutely.
And you could stub your toe on the table, and that could be the tipping point that could make you burst into tears in the middle of your living room, because it's just that. To someone else, it might just be a little thing, a slight annoyance, but for someone with ADHD, it could be that bit that is just that extra reinforcement of why can't I just function?
Absolutely. And I had exactly that thought so many times up until I realized, what ADHD actually entailed. And, I had my own kind of preconceptions about ADHD. And I think I also misunderstood a bit about, what ADHD would be like, especially as an adult or as a woman. And I blamed myself a lot for, different mistakes or things that people would see as careless. I mean, I lost so many things, things that were important to me. And I was always told, why are you so careless? Don't you even care? And those things hurt because you are distressed by you losing those things, because you didn't want to lose them either. You probably tried everything that you could not to lose them, and somehow you still end up losing them because some things are unfortunately a little bit out of your control when you have ADHD.
It's so relatable, and just hearing you say you lose certain things. I think I have a dog, and I always worry that I've left the flat door open, and I can, because I've done it in the past. But there's a real consequence if that happens again. The dog runs out, could get hit by a car. So if I'm not 100% sure that I've locked that front door, it will really ruin my day, because I have to know.
Do you know that kind of reminds me of a situation that I had just a few months ago? It was horrific, and I haven't even spoken about it on my social media because I was like, just a bit distraught, and I felt so ashamed by it as well. It was just, my daughter had learned how to open the door, and that wasn't a thing that she used to do before. And I was just getting ready and putting my makeup on, etc. My partner had said he was going to meet us at a restaurant, so he left already, and my daughter heard that, and she thought he was there at the car waiting for her. So she opened the door, ran out. I was doing my makeup, and I twigged that I could hear, birds chirping quite loudly. So I ran downstairs, noticing the door was open, my daughter not there. So I ran outside. Luckily, she wasn't far because the car had just been parked outside our house. So she was next to the car. So I bring her in. I was like shaking. I was like, oh my God, how did that even happen? You know? And then after I was like trying to regulate myself again, about 30 minutes later, I realized, where's our dog? We have a dog. Where is she?
Right. Okay.
And yeah, she had gone out after my daughter had gone out, and so we had to search her for the next 2 hours. I was crying, shaking. I felt so bad, so bad, because I was like, this is something I should have noticed. It's something I should have, prevented. Yeah. Luckily, our dog was found apparently very quickly after she'd run out and was brought to a vet nearby, and she was loving life. She was great. So luckily that story has a happy ending. But yeah, it's just how inattention can often also impact in day-to-day life when it's a bit more serious.
I'm so pleased that story had a happy ending. I can't imagine how I would feel if something happened for my dog, in a similar situation. But I think it brings back to the point is that you're suddenly, when you're a parent, not just responsible for your own safety and your own well-being. Suddenly you're responsible for someone else's safety and well-being. And many people, if you do sometimes struggle with looking after yourself, having to look after someone else suddenly, I imagine brings a whole load of challenges with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And because my daughter is always sort of the main focus. I used to say after I was relatively newly after I became a parent and before I kind of learned even more about ADHD, I used to say that part that used to be fine with having ADHD / the part that was there to mask my ADHD and to get by in life suddenly was so preoccupied by everything child related and everything mum related, and I suddenly felt I was unable to mask anymore. I was unable to kind of do those things that meant I could still be on time, for example, or could still get a project done even when I hyper focused on the wrong things for hours. And because often I would just then do work late in the evening to try and catch up on things. And that suddenly wasn't possible anymore. There was a lot of things that suddenly weren't possible anymore because that part of my brain was now, preoccupied with everything parenting related.
When you're having to look after a child, is it possible to burn out as a parent? And what
Absolutely.
I mean by that is when you have and I'm just speaking from someone who isn't a parent, so to just stop me if I say something completely ridiculous. But if you have a child, I imagine there's peaks and troughs of, and I'm relating it to the ADHD brain, peaks and troughs of the reward that you get from any situation. So when you're looking after a young human being, is it potentially the danger of getting into a situation where you're burnt out as a parent?
Absolutely, yeah. I think as well as women with ADHD, we are very prone to becoming perfectionists because of all the mistakes and things that were brought up in our early years. So we become almost obsessive over trying to get everything right. And that for me included also everything parenting related. So I obsessed over parenting research. I Googled the smallest things because I wanted to get everything right. And I know probably every parent sort of feels that way. Nobody wants to mess up as a parent, but it became so much that I neglected my own needs. Because I was so focused on trying to get everything exactly right. And that's kind of when my mental health just took a deep dive. And I just was in a constant state of overwhelm, overstimulation. I felt, burnt out. I think that is exactly the right way to put it.
It must be quite confusing for the child where there's value in being consistent. I imagine a child benefits from a consistent environment, a consistent response to behavior, consistent routines, consistent bedtimes, for example. And I imagine there's a contradiction there between, I just were to think if I were to become a parent, I can imagine the situations that I might do that might contradict that requirement for consistency. Do you see what I mean by that?
Absolutely. The Again, the issue that I specifically had, I was a little bit too perfectionist. So I had little apps that would tell me exactly, when was it feeding time, for breastfeeding back then, or when was it time to kind of make meals. And I was obsessing over it so much because I knew of the difficulties that I'd have for myself to uphold routines, that it inhibited me from, seeing friends, from being social. I would often not leave the house because I was like, right, she has to nap at this certain time until then, because otherwise, this is not gonna be good. And it became very anxiety inducing almost. So yeah, I did have a lot of issues with anxiety after I became a mum. I almost went into a little bit of I thought actually I had postpartum depression and anxiety, but the problem was I couldn't really relate with some bits of the postpartum anxiety and some bits of the postpartum depression until I found out afterwards, retrospectively, that was all because it was actually ADHD related and more like an ADHD burnout rather than it being actually postpartum anxiety or depression as such. I got seen by a therapist because I was just really, really low. And I was lucky enough to at some point have received intensive CBT, so cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety with ADHD. So I was sure to bring up that I had ADHD, and that surely changed my life in a positive way. It massively, massively improved my mental health and allowed me to then actually look up more about ADHD and how it impacted me. It allowed me to accept my diagnosis. It allowed me to accept how much ADHD was impacting my everyday life. And then from there on, I was able to let go of some of the guilt and shame and restrictions that I placed upon myself and that kind of perfectionistic behavior, I guess, which, resulted in a lot of anxiety, isolation, and knock-on mental health difficulties.
I think that's going to be so helpful for a lot of women and parents listening. With CBT therapy, what does that actually involve?
It's all about sort of changing your ways about looking at a certain situation. And I know some people with ADHD don't find it very helpful. I had to have two different therapists. I had first, normal CBT, which didn't help me at all. If anything, I felt like I was feeling a bit worse. And then I had this amazing therapist who did it intensively because she was like, I know you're a little bit more complex. And so she was more experienced, and I think she was able to kind of relay things to me in a way that kind of made my brain click a little bit. So we tackled a lot like things such as rumination. I used to ruminate a lot about certain situations that didn't go right because as neurodivergent people, our brains are so wired to problem solve everything. And if there's a situation that went wrong, I often would ruminate over them and think about, how else should I have reacted? What else should I have said? And it became, it went then into the anxiety bit where I then started to think about worst case scenarios and what would happen if I didn't do X, Y, Z to solve this perceived issue. And I know a lot of that had to do again with rejection sensitive dysphoria as well. But yeah, just kind of unlearning learned behaviors that were actually not very helpful at all, such as those rumination things and trying to solve things or fix problems that weren't actually there yet. And my therapist actually at the time, she kind of told me that a lot of the times we the anxiety stays around, or those kind of ruminating thoughts, because we do things that we believe makes then therefore these sort of thoughts helpful, because we react to them, right? So yeah, she kind of challenged me to get out of my comfort zone, to do things that were anxiety inducing, to stop doing things in an attempt to prevent certain things from happening, to be like, look, did you see nothing bad happened when you didn't say, hey, I'm sorry about the conversation earlier, maybe I've overshared, those sort of things. And she also kind of taught me that it's not my sole responsibility to fix somebody else's problem. If they're having a problem with me, it should be also up to them to come to me and tell me. And that was something that, I don't know, for some reason I thought to myself that was all up to me.
That sounds so powerful. And having that person, in your case a therapist,
Yeah.
to help you with that sort of unraveling process and building that self-awareness, I can see how that could just turn the pressure taps off a little bit and just alleviate some of that.
Yeah.
You mentioned RSD, rejection sensitive dysphoria, and how does being a parent and RSD, I suppose, clash?
Well, it's a very, very good question. It can be in multiple different ways. I remember thinking right after I became a parent that I had this wonderful little child, and I often looked at everyone else interacting with her, and I felt like I wasn't quite good enough. I wanted to, be the best person possible for her. But then later on, obviously, when she was a little bit older, I became very hurt if she expressed, wanting to be just with her dad, for example, or with somebody else. And that was something that I definitely had to work on, because I knew she loves me. No matter what, I'm her mum. There's no way that she doesn't love me at all times. It was just kind of getting my head around letting go of that kind of almost, I guess, control as well, and having to be the favorite at all times. I think that was my issue. I wanted to kind of prevent rejection from her, if that makes sense, to a certain point.
It makes total sense. I think the thing I would worry about if I were to become a parent is the response that I can sometimes go into during a episode of RSD, and exposing the child to the rage that might come out of an episode, shouting at the child, or them seeing me shouting at someone else, or just the shutdown.
Yeah.
So again, from someone who isn't a parent, is that something that is a worry?
Absolutely. I actually went exactly the opposite direction, because I had a lot of those kind of issues as a child, as a teenager. My emotions were very, very dysregulated. They still are, but I intensively looked into gentle parenting, therefore, which actually involved having to reparent myself and learning myself coping strategies to cope with, quote unquote, difficult behaviors. None of the feelings are difficult. Often just we have unhelpful learned coping strategies, and it was a long process. It's not something that can be learned, from today to tomorrow. It was a big learning curve. I've made, I did have a period where I was so angry a lot of the times. I never let it out at my daughter, because again, I was like being that perfectionist. I was trying to follow the gentle parenting, whereas it's like, no shouting, you try and be calm. But if you're internally raging, somewhere that's going to come out. And sometimes unfortunately, I let it out at my partner, I let it out on my dog, or, I threw pillows or, hit pillows, those sort of things to try and let out that rage. And it was something that I felt very, very ashamed of, until I kind of started to learn better coping strategies and learning how to reparent myself in those moments. And that often looks like validating your feelings. That was a very, very big one, because I think a lot of us are taught that those sort of emotions, such as anger, sadness, even to a point, they are overreactions. You shouldn't feel that way. Stop being angry, stop crying, those sort of things. And when you reparent yourself, you start telling yourself that it's okay to feel angry. It's absolutely understandable to feel angry in this point. It's okay to feel frustrated. It's okay to feel that sort of tension, and actually allow that. And then kind of reframe it and be like, okay, what if I was my daughter, for example, right now? What would I tell her if she was angry? What could she do to help with that anger? And I started to find some coping strategies that were going outside the room when I felt that anger, that rage coming up. Going out and kind of just shutting a little bit those sensory, that additional overstimulation that could obviously often intensify those feelings, shutting that off. Breathing, I practiced a lot of mindfulness. It was like kind of almost like a sensory reset, of trying to focus intently on all the different things that you could hear without labeling them, because actually when you label what you hear, a lot of the times we subconsciously assign judgments and feelings to those. So when you really practice that, you learn to just be present and, let everything just be, which is very, very difficult. Again, didn't happen from, within one day, not even within a week. It's still a learning curve up until this point. Quite happy, relatively happy now, how I manage my dysregulation. But do I still get dysregulated? Absolutely, a lot. It's just about finding the ways or the things that can help you with coping that without, harming objects that mean a lot to you, or without, hurting somebody else's feelings.
Gosh, I got lost in that. That was fascinating.
Sorry.
Thank you for No, that was wonderful. I was listening intently, and there's so much in there. I think the emotional dysregulation is such a broad topic, and I'm thinking of the people who perhaps aren't aware that they have it, if that's the right phrase, and how much. And maybe that presents additional challenges of a parent that maybe isn't even aware that they have ADHD.
Absolutely.
But they have the emotional dysregulation and all of the stuff that goes with that. So I suppose my question is, is there anything somebody who might be listening what could they watch out for, signs perhaps of maybe undiagnosed ADHD in a parent?
Oh, there's a lot of different things. I think a big one is struggling to manage household chores and tasks. I mean, that's difficult anyway when you have ADHD. When you become a parent, it's a whole new level. Keeping on top of tasks such as laundry and doing the shopping, the groceries, making meal plan choices, those sort of things, they suddenly become overwhelmingly hard. Often I leave the laundry until there's the urgency to do it, because there's no fresh pair of underwear to wear, for example, and then I'm like, oh my God, I've got like 5 piles of laundry today. So with that comes then the very frequent feeling of feeling overstimulated and overwhelmed. I would say that is a big one to look out for. It certainly affected me a lot, unknowingly. And that feeling of overstimulation that I'm talking about, which often then, triggers the emotional dysregulation, can sometimes feel like a staggering feeling or intensifying feeling of tension. Sometimes I feel like, little bits of pieces, such as different noises, different, visual stimuli, for example, that I've got in my head, different things to keep it on top of, they would mount to this internal tension and pressure until it's at some point just boils over. Just one little thing, it can trip it over. For example, I don't know, technology not working, and I could be, there's a lot more things, obviously, that I'd watch out for, such as feeling anxious, being that sort of that perfectionist, forgetting things, important things such as appointments, play dates, or even special occasion days at nursery, which I unfortunately tend to forget. Struggling with paperwork, opening letters, keeping on top of bills, regular payments, those sort of things are all big struggles. And then, what else? Not being, often zoning out, for example, when you play with your child, you might have little bursts of where you're very actively engaged, but then you quickly find yourself distracted by other things. You zone out, you kind of become almost understimulated by repetition. When there's repetitive tasks, struggling with routine is a big one as well. There's a lot of things.
Yeah, that's quite the exhaustive list. I think it's really useful, because I think there will be a lot of people listening that suspect or haven't got a diagnosis, and I think that will point them in the right direction. And I think it's I saw a post, and it made me quite sad, because it was about parenting with ADHD, and there was a clear consensus in the comments that, or the most common comment I saw was somebody thinking that they were a bad parent because of the emotional dysregulation, and because they maybe forgot an appointment, or they shouted at their child, or they're aware that their child heard an argument, and the guilt that leads to, and the regret. So I guess the question is that something you've experienced? And do you have any advice for someone who might be in that moment of regret?
Yes. It's actually another common symptom that especially mums with ADHD experience, possibly dads as well, but I've read that about mums, that we often compare ourselves to other mums and feel like we're falling short in almost all areas. There's a lot of guilt and shame involved in that, because, you struggle with things that you don't want to struggle with. You forget birthday parties, you forget those gifts, you maybe don't hear your child shouting that they're finished with the toilet. It's those sort of moments. But what I would strongly advise is trying to first acknowledge and realize that you are feeling currently negative feelings about yourself. You have negative thoughts. They still creep up for me as well, especially when something bad has happened. I mean, the other day I forgot a gift that my daughter made for another boy at nursery, to kind of say, look, you're not alone. It was a very sweet gesture. and I forgot it. I forgot it at home, and I felt so bad, and I felt so dysregulated, and I found myself getting quite frustrated and angry, and I snapped at her a little bit, and I felt bad. And I noticed very quickly afterwards, or that, because I've been practicing that I was, one, feeling guilty and ashamed of having forgotten that thing, and two, that I snapped at her wrongly. I mean, yes, I was dysregulated, but I felt like I shouldn't have snapped at her. So I told her that. And for me, that's one of the biggest things. We're not perfect. We all make mistakes. We all, get dysregulated sometimes. It's, one, about forgiving yourself for that. And then two, letting your child know that, maybe it was wrong to shout, or saying, look, I'm sorry, mummy shouted. I shouldn't have shouted. Maybe next time I'll take a deep breath. Those sort of things. And maybe you're not able to do that. But by apologizing, I find, to a child for having been dysregulated, you model a few different things. You model, for one, that you make mistakes. Two, what you do after you've made a mistake, you apologize. And three, you model to them what they could maybe do instead of shouting when they feel frustrated. By saying what things usually help you. And then on top of that, but you're not always in that state. When I'm dysregulated, I can't just say I'm sorry. So firstly, I have to identify that I feel dysregulated, and then monitor my thoughts. And again, a lot of the times feelings of guilt and shame come up, and then validating again my thoughts and feelings, saying it's okay to not feel okay right now. It's okay to feel overwhelmed, angry, those sort of things. But it doesn't make me a bad parent. I'm still a great parent regardless. My daughter feels loved. That's all she needs. And it's okay to not be perfect at all times. And then kind of allow myself to, feel those feelings, because a lot of the times we try to push away those negative feelings because nobody wants to feel negative feelings. But by pushing them away, actually sometimes makes them worse. And by giving yourself grace, that can be in itself quite regulating. And then once I feel like I'm accepting myself more again, like accepting and forgiving myself with the difficulties that I've had, I can then use the strategies to further regulate myself, such as, breathing, using smells, using textures, those sort of things. Yeah. So there's a whole array of different things that you might be able to do that to help with your dysregulation in the moment, and then to repair afterwards.
That's super helpful, and I think it's particularly poignant for this conversation. Sometimes it's just breaking down what you said, and the simplest things, like just giving the acceptance and the awareness of what's happened, and having an understanding of why you responded in a certain way, so you can go slightly easier on yourself.
Yes.
And that can alleviate the shame and the guilt, because there's a reason out of your control why that's happening.
Yeah, because with emotional dysregulation, often actually there's a certain miscommunication almost within the brain. So there's a part of your brain that monitors your response to certain things, that monitors, reflects, and changes your response. And there's then the other part of the brain that feels those feelings and that can trigger certain responses. And the part that regulates your response to things, isn't very good at communicating with the other part of the brain that is there to kind of put out those behaviors and feelings in the moment when you're feeling dysregulated. So it often then turns out that you have a response that might be seen as disproportionate to the cause or to the trigger. But in the moment, there's not a lot that you can do, unfortunately, because it literally, your brain is it's trying, but it's not quite getting there. By regulating yourself and being in being logical or kind of reasonable, quote unquote, with your response. You feel those feelings, and those feelings are, they're going to be felt. There's not a lot that you can do in that moment, and it's not your fault. It's about then kind of learning how you let out those feelings, and how to get over those feelings.
It's so true, because I think of when that response to a, say, rejection happens, and that internalized rage comes in, like when you're in that moment, during that 20 minutes or half an hour, or sometimes half a day afterwards, then you don't really have control over how you're reacting to it, and you can
absolutely
pretend to be rational and to have a back and forth with the person or the situation that caused it, but really you're just not thinking straight.
Absolutely. And so, which is why it's so important to just validate your feelings, sit in them, and learn different ways to let out those feelings, rather than, for example, shouting.
from being a mother, and I'm thinking of, I struggle to plan my own meal times and my own schedule, and the thought of having to do that and also be responsible for another human being, that makes me anxious.
Yeah.
And my traits, I would say, are fairly stable throughout the month. They're quite predictable. I can manage them through how I've learnt to over my life. With women, and after you've had a child, and with the menstrual cycle, do you still go through those peaks and troughs depending on where you are?
Yeah, absolutely. And just in the funny thing is, well, it's not actually funny. The issue really is a lot of the times with ADHD we have difficulties with something that's called passive processing. Again, it's got to do with the part of your brain that is there to monitor, reflect, and change behaviors depending on the situation. So I often don't connect certain bits until, like, for example, I have my period. So a lot of the times I'll have some days where I'm really emotional, and then feel very, very quickly dysregulated, and I snap quickly, or cry quickly, or I'm very quickly tense, or, those sort of things. And a lot of those times, those symptoms are always a few days before my period, but for some reason, whilst I'm in that state, I never think, oh yeah, that's the reason. So yeah, there's obviously still difficulties with that, with a monthly cycle, but then you also have many unexpected situations happening in your day. I think it's fair to say when you're a parent, no day is very much like the day before. So there's a lot of unexpected changes, which can in itself be quite triggering at times. And yeah, sorry, I just lost track of where I was going with this.
No, thank you so much. It's super fascinating, and from someone who isn't a parent, I feel like I'm already learning a lot from you. Is there anything else? Because this was one of the topics that is constantly requested that I cover, and I'm not a parent, as I've said, and I just don't want to. I want to make sure that I give it justice, and I don't leave anything out. Is there anything that you think that you would like to talk about?
I think it's just really, really important, I feel like, to recognize when you might need support, when you might need additional support, and not just recognize that, but actually ask for support. And because often we have rejection sensitive dysphoria, we tend to not want to ask for support because we fear that there's going to be judgment if we ask for support. But truth be told, every parent will need support one at a time, but especially if you've got ADHD, you're so much more prone to, being burnt out, as we talked about earlier, to feeling overstimulated, those sort of things. So if there is anyone that you can ask for support, or even if it's going to professionals, I think that would be very, very valuable. Apart from obviously, giving yourself some grace, trying different tools and allowing yourself to use tools that might help you with certain things, certain aspects, such as, overstimulation or organization things, but planning for obstacles to happen, planning for that routines won't always look the same, and that's okay. Bedtime won't always be at 7 p.m. Sometimes I've learned to accept, for example, that, my daughter goes to bed anytime between 6 and 8 p.m. and that's fine. That's a totally acceptable window. And I've accepted that. It doesn't have to be every single day that you're on the dot. I mean, we often have, I read the other day, the reason why we, with ADHD often struggle with routines is because we have that often that misconception that routines often, they always have to look the same, but they don't actually always have to look the same. There can be variation in every single routine as long as the outcome is the same. So allowing yourself to have variations as well, to kind of plan in things that will make your day a little bit less lonely, less isolating, less overwhelming. If you're going to use screen time, do use screen time, by all means. Yeah.
I already feel like I am much more equipped if I ever become a parent. I think it's, for the listeners, I imagine this has been super helpful. Where can people find you, Geraldine, if they want to follow you?
I've got my social media channel is called cherry.adhd. So
Brilliant.
you can find me on Instagram, Facebook, or TikTok under that name.
I'll link all of that on the show notes underneath. Gosh, yeah. I mean, this has been fascinating for me, Geraldine. I have genuinely learned so much, and I can see how what you've said can be applied. And it's funny that I relate, because the only thing I can relate to is being a dog owner, and I know that's in no way comparable. But I'm going to take some of what you've said.
There's still absolutely responsibility in that. And actually, I learned often the reason why symptoms may become amplified after you become a parent is because of those added responsibilities. So, the more responsibilities you have, the more your struggles are going to be apparent.
It's fascinating. And I think, super excited to get this episode out. Geraldine.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much as well. And I'm sorry I know this has been a lot, but still at the same time not enough. I'm very sure I've forgotten to mention several very important bits, as you do with ADHD. But yeah, so there's more to it, I'm sure. I know.
I'll make sure that your profiles are linked underneath, because you put out content around this topic, a lot of it. And yes. I think if people want to find out more, then there's a ton of information that they can find. And thank you, Geraldine, so much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks so much. It was a pleasure.